Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, the biggest news story internationally of the day, of course, is the Biden decision to pull out of Afghanistan starting on May 1st. Of course, he will not, though, be meeting the complete withdrawal deadline as laid out in the deal that had been signed between the Taliban and Donald Trump. Now, there are, of course, people on both sides of this argument, those who are happy that the U.S. will be leaving Afghanistan, and on the other side, there are many who are very worried about what then happens next. And those are now the questions that we're going to put to our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. We're joined by Dr. Victoria C. Fontan, who is a professor of peace and conflict studies at the American University of Afghanistan. She's joining us today from Kabul. We're also joined from New York by Dr. Adam Weinstein, who is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Adam and Victoria, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Adam, let me start with you. What do you make of the decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan? I mean, Biden made a very passionate speech, didn't he, saying that he didn't want to pass this on to a fifth president. Is this smart?
I do support Biden's decision only because I think that there's not a U.S. military solution to the conflict. But I also think we should recognize that there's going to be real suffering as a result in Afghanistan. So it's a bittersweet moment. It's not a time for celebration. I think it's a time for reflection as to why this mission failed.
Victoria, what are your thoughts about this? Because, you know, especially on the ground, seemingly in Kabul, there are many people who are worried about what then happens once the U.S. leaves.
Absolutely. First of all, I think it's an absolutely wrong decision. Whether we agree with the decision to actually get into Afghanistan in the first place in 2001 or not, I personally think it is an invasion. However, if you start the job, you have to finish it. Now the job is not finished. Al-Qaeda is still in the country. The Taliban are winning militarily. There are other groups out there that are creating havoc in different parts of the country. And people in Kabul and in other big cities in Afghanistan are worried because the government is not in a position to actually fight all those different groups that are going to be competing heavily for power once the US troops and NATO troops pull out. So from the perspective of many people on the ground, there was nightmares about to happen. The Taliban are about to come back to power. And in a way, all that has been achieved in the past 20 years is going to vanish in a few months in the minds of many. And of course, I do hope that this is not going to happen, that the Taliban are different, that the there can be a political settlement reached between all the different parties to the conflict here in Afghanistan, except international parties to the conflict that are going to leave. But it is very unlikely that there is going to be any political settlement established between different political factions. And so the future is quite bleak from this announcement of the Biden administration.
Adam, I wonder what more could have been done. We're so many years into the involvement of the U.S. In Afghanistan, and sure, some things have been achieved. I'm sure we can probably list them, but overall, I mean, one would say the situation has not yet stabilized completely in the way that the U.S. would have wanted. What are your thoughts about if the U.S. remains for a lot longer? Can things be stabilized?
I don't think so. Look, I agree with the other guest's assessment that a negotiated settlement is unlikely. And of course, even if it were achieved, most peace deals fall apart in the implementation phase anyway, if you look at history. And I also don't doubt her assessment of how people feel in Kabul. And I don't think the Taliban have changed, per se. Perhaps a settlement is possible, and perhaps when the U.S. troops leave, the Afghan security forces will have the resolve to fight and win. But I'm not sure that the United States could have shaped the outcome, even if it stayed for another decade. I fought in Afghanistan as part of the surge in 2012, which was at the tail end of the surge, and at times there were 100,000 troops in the country, and that didn't make a long-term difference. We won the direct firefight. We were able to take territory, but as soon as we left, that territory was left, surrendered to the Taliban, essentially. So there was no sustainable progress, and I think that's the issue. And the notion that the United States should fight a war for over a generation with 20,000 plus injuries and over thousands of deaths. I don't think that's not something that's politically viable for the United States. And even if it were, I don't think it would be able to shape outcomes in Afghanistan because the drivers of the conflict are so complex. This is a 40-year war. It's not a 20-year war. And I think that's the issue.
Victoria, you're on the ground there, right? So certainly, I'm not discrediting, as Adam said, of course, what you've heard from around you, certainly people saying they're in Kabul. But I wonder what then should have been done instead of the announcement of this withdrawal, do you think?
Well, everybody has been going on at the Trump administration with regards to its different foreign policy. But what the Trump administration had put in place was a conditional negotiation for withdrawal. And what the Biden administration has completely destroyed is this conditionality. And I think that if proper conditions had been put forward, and if the Biden administration had insisted on those conditions, then a regional stabilization force could have been established with U.S. air support, and it could have given a completely different outcome. I do understand, of course, that the Afghan government was unwilling to negotiate with the Taliban and has been a spoiler of the Doha negotiations from the start. So I'm not trying to say that the U.S. administration is completely at fault here. They basically saw that the Afghan government was not ready to negotiate under any circumstance, and they said, look, there's nothing else we can do. We have to leave. We cannot continue this any longer. However, again, conditionality could have changed everything, and maybe it is still possible to try once more. The Ghani government now is quite clear that the Biden administration is not joking. The Blinken letter was very clear back in February, but they probably still thought they had some leeway and some leverage. They have this zero leverage. Now they have to show for one last time that they can negotiate. Otherwise, they're going to be out of power very soon and very fast anyway.
As we're speaking, Adam, I believe Blinken has actually made a trip to Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken, to try to sell that deal to the Afghan government. Will that work? I mean, in the sense that from your time on the ground, do you think the Afghan government will now be able to trust the Americans?
As the other guest said, the Blinken letter was clear, and yet the Ghani administration rejected the U.S. proposed peace plan and came up with a completely unrealistic peace plan that they knew the Taliban would reject. That being said, I would still place the majority of the blame on talks falling apart on the Taliban. The Taliban engaged in incredibly high rates of violence throughout the last year. So as much as the Afghan government created delays, I think the majority of the blame falls on the Taliban. But this takes us back to the crux of the matter, which is that the United States cannot shape these outcomes. Whatever leverage is provided by U.S. troops is not really actionable leverage unless the Taliban think the United States are going to remain in Afghanistan forever, and nobody thinks that. I think that with the U.S. leaving, perhaps the Afghan government will be more willing to negotiate. But then again, it was the Taliban that pulled out from negotiations. So look, it's a bleak, dismal situation. And I understand why Afghans are deeply concerned. But I don't think one more go at it would make a difference at this point.
Victoria, there would also be the argument to be made, which I know you alluded to earlier on in your first answer, saying that had the U.S. not gotten involved at all in Afghanistan, we would be in a very different situation. But now that it has a responsibility before leaving. But nevertheless, even now, the argument, Victoria, is that let the region's people handle their own issues. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that, the region has been handling the Afghan conflict for some time. It's quite obvious and clear to many interlocutors that different regional powers are already playing a role in the conflict in Afghanistan as it stands. And so I would say that if the region was capable of helping towards a positive outcome, that would have been the case. However, I think that since you are located in Pakistan, what's really important to recognize is that there has always already been incursions of insurgent/terrorist elements from the Afghan border into Pakistan, destabilizing Pakistan. And I think that indeed a regional solution is extremely important, and a complete change of strategy from regional and neighboring powers is extremely important, because this Afghan mess will bite them in the back and will definitely destabilize their own borders. And I think that this is something to acknowledge, to understand. If Afghanistan is left to suffer on its own, we can be very sure that the region will also be, let's say, pay the consequences of that particular political game.
So then on that point then, Adam, of the Taliban, if we're completely honest, from the Afghan people's point of view, from what you know, would they be okay with the Taliban taking over, firstly, if that were to happen, as many people say is likely if the U.S. were to leave right now, and B, for the regional countries, right? So even the Iranians, for example, have been criticized a lot for having relations with the Taliban, but nevertheless, I mean, I would think that they would argue, listen, we saw this day coming, so we had to have good relations with whoever we thought was going to come into power at some point. What are your thoughts on that?
From my understanding, I think the majority of Afghans still support the concept of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and not a Taliban emirate. There's some Afghans that support the Taliban. The notion that the Taliban have no support is not true, but I don't think the majority of Afghans support them.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. The clock has gotten the best of us. We appreciate both Adam and Victoria for taking their time out of their respective busy schedules to share their thoughts with us. We were discussing there the Biden decision to pull out from Afghanistan starting on May 1st, an unconditional release, by the way, or withdrawal, pardon me, I should say, in fact, of U.S. troops, as the Taliban have always wanted. Nevertheless, this will be going over the deadline. What does this mean then for Afghanistan, for the region, for the Afghan people themselves, for governance in Afghanistan going forward? Who then takes over? Many people are talking, of course, about a Taliban takeover completely. Maybe that is too preemptive at this point in time to say. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss tensions on the border between Russia and Ukraine. We know that there has been a significant military buildup right at the border with Ukraine. On the NATO side, there are fears that Russia may be wanting to carry out an invasion of some sort. On the other side, of course, the Russians would argue that, in fact, this is a response to NATO moves, which has been happening for a while now, close to its border, NATO expansion, as the Russians would call it, as well as, of course, unhelpful moves by the Ukrainian government themselves and military. Also, we know that there are still very much disagreements over Donbass, Crimea, etc. as well, which, of course, have also fostered the situation as we currently see it. On top of this, then, we've had an effort, an outreach seemingly by Joe Biden, the U.S. president, to Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. They've spoken on the phone about these and other issues. And Biden has proposed a summit, a face-to-face summit, seemingly, in a third country. At this point in time, at least to the best of my knowledge, the Russians have not accepted that, but they may possibly do so if they feel it's in their interest. Would that work? Would that help at this point in time to decrease tensions along that border? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Miro, Popkhadze, who is a fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute, joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us today from Perm, Russia, is Dr. Pavel Luzin, who is a contributor at Jamestown Foundation and Riddle. Pavel and Miro, thank you both for taking your time out to join us here in Scope today. Miro, I'd like to start with you. NATO is saying this is the largest massing of Russian troops at the Ukraine border. Do you think that the Russians would really be planning an invasion?
I think it's highly unlikely that Russians will attack for certain reasons. But we need to step back and we need to see what the Russians are trying to accomplish and how Putin sees the world. Putin sees the world as a multipolar world in which Russia sees itself as a global power of attraction, and wants to be treated as such. And it's been in the last 30 years after the end of the Cold War, United States always considered Russia as a regional and declining power, which has actually created some irritation in Moscow and at the Kremlin. And this is one of the attempts, I would say, that Russia is trying to get appropriate attention from the White House. And also, this would be another attempt, actually, from Russian side to test the new Biden's administration. Basically, they want to know what's the depth of Biden's commitment to Ukraine's security. And Russia is also, I think, testing NATO alliance and alliance of democracies, how committed they are to the values and the principles. And Russians are constantly probing and testing and seeing opportunities. But at this point, I think it's highly unlikely that Russians will use full-scale operations against Ukrainians.
Okay, so Pavel, why then mass these troops? Is it, as Miro there said, an attention-seeking move? What do you make of it?
So, in my opinion, it was a pressure, political pressure, military pressure towards Ukraine and towards the West to achieve the one important goal. The goal is keeping the political initiative in Kremlin's hands. Because you know that there is a new administration in the United States. The Minsk agreements are in deadlock. They are dying. And everyone knows that there is no future in Minsk agreements. The Normandy format is dying because Angela Merkel is going to be retired from power. So what to do? Russia tried to switch on the game, the political game, to keep the initiative. Russia tried to make a pressure towards Ukraine. Okay, guys, Minsk agreements are dying, but nevertheless, let's realize this agreement in our, in Russian, of course, conditions. If you will not realize these agreements, we will do what we want to do. And at the same time, Russia tried to engage the United States, of course, because if Ukraine spoke several years that the United States should be engaged in Normandy format, Russia decided to do this on its own conditions as well. So it was a military pressure for keeping political initiative. Of course, Russia didn't want to invade Ukraine this time.
Right.
Okay.
So Miro, tell us then, in your opinion at least, what the American stance will be then going forward. I mean, Biden's already proposed this summit. What more will NATO/the US do?
Well, there is a consideration going on in Washington D.C. Obviously, Russia is not on top of United States list of priorities. As we know, the United States, what Obama proclaimed 10 years ago, that the United States needs to focus more on Asia. Now it's unfolding. Taking place now in reality. So what the Biden administration will do, why Biden administration probably will try to engage Vladimir Putin, and it will send a clear message that the United States cannot tolerate changing forcefully borders in center of Europe, and United States' commitment to support territorial integrity and sovereignty of independent Ukraine. And United States, on the other hand, will consider increasing its support to Ukrainian state, because if United States fails Ukraine, then China is watching. I think United States will, with its NATO allies, do as much as it can to support and strengthen Zelensky and support Ukrainian state to deter Russia and to defend Ukraine.
Interestingly, just recently, Pavel, I was reading an intelligence report by the Americans about Russia, saying that, in fact, Russia does want better relations with the Americans. I mean, is that possible at this point in time, even with these Russians' actions, and as well as what has happened throughout the Trump years as well? As you know, there was a lot of negative press about Russia, be it cyber attacks, election meddling, etc.
Russia definitely wants to keep better relations with the United States, to get better relations with the United States, with Europe, but on the Russian conditions, because Kremlin doesn't want to face sanctions, because sanctions create a lot of damage to Russian economy, especially to Russian defense industry. Kremlin doesn't want to hear something about human rights, about corruption, and so on and so on. Of course, Kremlin doesn't want to hear something about democracy. So Kremlin wants to talk with the United States, but only on its own conditions. That's the main problem, and at the same time, Kremlin is not able to play according the international rules, according the international agreements. That's another big problem of Russia. American relations or Russia-Western relations. So that's a big and long-term challenge that we see currently in all these diplomatic international relations troubles.
Yeah. Miro, I would imagine the Russians have a long list of grievances against the Americans as well as the Ukrainians, in fact, and NATO. Do you think that the other side is listening to the Russian grievances as well?
I think I would agree with what Pavel just said. But I mean, what I want to add to this is that Russia is really officially saying that it wants to have a good relationship with the West. But I don't think that this is true, because Russia uses European Union and United States uses as something to something as an enemy to rally public around the flag, to mobilize its support, because Russia has serious problems domestically. Economy stagnated. It has Navalny problems. Navalny is one of the formidable opponents of Vladimir Putin in the 30 years, and allegedly he was poisoned a few months ago by Russian intelligence, and then he was imprisoned. So Russia has serious problems domestically, and Russia uses United States to distract attention from real issues and mobilize its support domestically against the United States, against so-called fifth column and European Union. So basically, Russia does not really want that. If you really observe and take a serious look at the domestic discussions and the propaganda campaign Russia is waging, Russia really does not want to do it. It utilizes West as an enemy to, as I said, mobilize its support. And now we know, well, that it's a Duma election is coming up in September, and Putin's popularity is at an all-time low. His party is not doing, and also we see the mismanagement of COVID-19. There are lots of grievances. So Russia is using United States and so-called NATO expansion as a reason to legitimize its claims.
All right, we'll have to leave there as a final word, but we really appreciate both Miro and Pavel for taking their time out of their schedules to speak to us today here in Scope. We were discussing there Russia-Ukraine tensions, but this is, of course, once it includes Ukraine, it includes NATO as well, even though, mind you, Ukraine is not a NATO member at this time, as much as it wants to become one very soon. But the NATO members and NATO alliance has said Ukraine needs to enter into significant reforms before it can do so. Nevertheless, we've had an attempt by Biden, the U.S. president, to try to ratchet down the tensions, even though Russia has amassed a significant number of troops on the Ukrainian border. Donbass, Crimea, still very open issues, at least for the Western countries and NATO. Can all of the above be resolved and even discussed openly, really? And will they be discussed? Will there be a summit between Biden and Putin? That, of course, is something that we're going to wait and see in the coming days, how the Russians react to that offer altogether. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. And in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Israel-Iran tensions. Now, this is specifically, of course, always existed, but this has specifically now come out onto the seas, where we've had tit-for-tat attacks seemingly on each other's ships. And the most recent is an Israeli ship, which was docked at a port in Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. Now, of course, as I said, this is not the first time that we've had tensions between these two sides. There have been cyber attacks in the past as well. This all, though, comes in the context of Vienna talks, right, where there is an aim by the Europeans, at least, to try to have the Americans come back into the JCPOA. Could these sorts of tensions pose a threat to any such revival of the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal overall? How much worse can this situation get, this shadow war, quote unquote, as we may call it? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Nicos, who is an assistant professor in international politics at American College. He is joining us today from Nicosia in Cyprus. And joining us today from Tehran is Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, who is a PhD candidate in American Studies at the University of Tehran. Hamidreza and Nick, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Nick, let me start with you. How dangerous, possibly, is this shadow war between the Israelis and the Iranians?
Yes, first of all, I would like to say, as you have said, that the ongoing tensions are not new. There are tensions that we must put it in the wider context of hybrid war between the two arch-enemies, Iran and Israel. And yes, I think they are very dangerous because out of this, we may have a spiral of tensions and actions and counteractions that may put in danger the whole talks and the effort of the European powers to bring America back in the deal. Because as you know, Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018. According to my humble opinion, it was an illegal and bad move.
Hamidreza, of course, I forgot to mention Natanz, and that was a huge incident that just recently happened, the explosion there. What do you make of that event, as well as the other events that have happened, the ships, etc., the tit-for-tat back and forth between the Israelis and the Iranians? Can this get out of hand?
As Nicos just said, it is nothing new. The war has been going for many years and many decades between Iran and the Zionist regime. But the point is that we can say the media strategy of the two sides are totally different and opposite to each other. Iranians try to be quiet about whatever they do against the Israeli regime, and the Israelis try to even exaggerate about what they have done. And so there have many cases, especially when there was war in Syria. Of course, it is still going on, but in the past, when the tension was higher, the Israelis used to brag about what they did, or even make false claims about what they have supposedly done. But the point is that whatever they have done against Iranians, they have received the response from the Iranian side. So this is nothing new again. Sometimes one side has a upper hand or can actually inflict heavy casualties on the other side. For example, the Natanz incident, as you just mentioned, is one of those cases that Israelis could inflict a damage which is considerable against Iran. But the cases like the ships are nothing new, and it has actually turned into something routine between the two. Another point is that it is not just such things that are going on. There are other things going on as well. For example, there were some news about attack on some intelligence unit in Erbil in Iraq. Yeah. There has been and other cases as well that sometimes they open their ways into the media, sometimes not. But the timing is also important, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, that it is coinciding with the ongoing talks in Vienna. And we know that the Israelis are the number one enemy of the JCPOA, and they want to kill any potentialities for revival of the deal. So they are doing their best. That's actually their mindset seems to be like, we attack, either Iran responds or not. If not, that's good. If it responds, then we can take it as some leverage against the ongoing talks and diplomatic methods that are going on in Vienna.
So let me put that point, Hamidreza, to Nick, because Nick, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Do you think that the worst thing that could possibly happen right now is that these tensions actually hurt the Vienna talks and the possibility of the Americans to come back to the deal?
I think there is enough prudence and flexibility by the Biden administration, and it has shown that it wants to come back. Okay, there are some technical issues. Tehran wants all the sanctions to be lifted before it stops the enrichment of uranium. The Americans want Tehran to stop the enrichment. Okay, there are some technical issues. I think that according to the last statement by Biden's last statement, he shows that he wants to do the best in order to survive the deal, to save the deal. Because without the deal, if we go back and remind and recall what happened, what was the alternative? We had on the one side the deal that curtailed the enrichment of uranium, of Iran's uranium program, and on the other hand, we had instability and the eventuality of an imminent war. In politics, you have to make difficult choices. Yeah. So the Americans are trying to save the deal, and this was the gravity center of the Europeans. This was the aim of the Europeans, to save the deal regarding irrespective of what happened. Now, another question that arises is, can the deal now be saved because some time lapsed, some actions were made by both sides, by Tehran. We have now Israel showing and sending these messages that it will do anything to obstruct the whole situation. I don't know. The imminent future will show.
Hamidreza, the Iranians have now announced that in response to what happened at Natanz, they're going to be enriching uranium to a 60% purity. Do you think that Iran is also taking steps possibly now which are irreversible and make things a lot harder?
From the day one, 1 year after the withdrawal of the United States from the deal, Iran began to take some steps in retaliation for lack of commitment from the other side. From day one, all the steps that Iran has taken are those steps that can be reversed immediately. So the enrichment, the level of enrichment can be set momentarily and based on the decision of the Iranian officials. So if they are now enriching for 60%, it can be reduced to 20 or even 5%, as was agreed in the JCPOA, or it can even be more than 60%. So number of the centrifuges, number of cascades, the level of the enrichment, all this, and the stockpile, of course, all of them are something that can be managed easily and can be reversed momentarily. So Iran is not concerned about that, but it is taking steps and increasing the levels and the steps to have first some bargaining chips on the table for the negotiations, and of course to retaliate the inaction of the other side, other parties of the deal, and of course let's say the persistence of the Americans to lift the sanctions and get back to the deal.
Hamidreza, I'll give you the final word, in fact, before I let both of you go. What do you think, if anything, Vienna can achieve then with this entire Israel issue hanging over it, right? Because whether we like it or not, the Americans will be swayed by the Israelis, or do you think that the Americans are in a position, Hamidreza, to make their independent decision about the Iran nuclear deal?
You know, there is a chess going on between Washington and Tel Aviv. That Washington is trying to have the upper hand and not follow the whatever Netanyahu, Tel Aviv, and the Israelis want, unlike Trump administration. So it seems that they have some challenges here in between. They don't want to stop support for the Israel. On the other side, they don't want the Israelis decide for the Americans and for the White House. So they have a tough game going on, actually. But it seems that the only way the Americans have to have both Israelis and the Iran deal is to follow what Iran demands, to stop the sanctions, lift only sanctions, and then get back to the deal as is demanded and requested by Iran. So that is the only way to keep the deal, and the time frame is not too long. There are some limits based on the law by the Iranian parliament.
Okay, I'm being told I have an extra minute, so Nick, I'll give you the final word. What do you think will happen within Vienna? How much of an influence will Israel have in America's decision-making when it comes to possibly re-entering the JCPOA at this time?
I don't know what will happen, but I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that we will have results after the Vienna talks. I think they have just started now 20 minutes ago, if I'm right. I think that the American administration understands quite well that the issue with Iran has to be solved because it's a regional issue with global dimensions. We have also the proxy war in Syria, the antagonism between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So America wants to focus on this problem and solve it, as I believe. This is my comment on this.
We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Nick and Hamidreza for taking their time out of their busy schedules to speak to us today, sharing their insight with us about this shadow war, as I called it, and as many others are calling it, between the Israelis and the Iranians. As both of our guests are mentioned, certainly not a new thing, at least to the extent of ships being attacked, tit-for-tat attacks on each other's ships. But then this entire attack on Natanz, I mean, that too has happened in the past in another fashion, in another medium, vis-a-vis Stuxnet, or the virus that had been brought into one of the Iranian nuclear facilities. This is many years ago, of course, now. But nevertheless, this latest explosion, Natanz, the Iranians blaming the Israelis, saying that they will now enrich uranium to a 60% purity because of that, as a response to that. How much of a spanner will this throw in the works when it comes to the American possible re-entry into the JCPOA? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.